Okay. So what did I just do? I brought over this material into this file by duplicating it over. I'm going to bring that layer into my Marble folder. And I think what I'll do, and I think what you should all do, is we'll create this set of subfolders inside of Marble. So I'm going to open up my other file just to show you an example. Okay. If you're looking carefully at my layers here under Marble, these are the subfolders that I want just to organize everything. Reflected light, reflective highlights, light decay, materials, shadow, reflection. So I'm going to do that here too. Under my Marble folder, I'm going to create a subfolder. Make sure that it's nestled within it. I'm going to call this material, or I'm going to start from the top, reflective highlights. Next one is reflective light, so another subfolder. Reflected light. My next one is light decay. And I'm doing this now because then I can just copy it over to all of my other materials and I don't have to rewrite these all again. Materials, shadows, and reflection. Materials, shadows, and reflection. Okay. Let me just make sure they're in the right order. Reflected light, highlights, and then light decay. Reflected light, highlights, and then light decay. Then materials. Shadows at the bottom. And then reflection. And I'll actually write this down here so that you can remember it. Reflected highlight, reflected light, light decay, materials, which will contain the swatches, shadows, and reflection. Okay. Because once I create these 6 folders in this order, I can just copy them over to my other material folders, so to my matte pattern, my shiny pattern, my wood, my fabric, by selecting all 6, so selecting the top one, shift selecting the bottom one, and then holding Option, clicking and dragging and bringing them into my other folders. And I should know that I'm doing it right because look at my cursor. My cursor has a black and white arrow on it, meaning it's going to copy. So I'm going to copy it into all the other folders for fabric, for wood, matte pattern, shiny pattern, and reflective pattern. And I'm doing it early on because I want to do it while all these folders are empty, because if I do it when there's layers inside, then all of that layer information is going to copy over, and it's not going to be what it's supposed to look like, and then I'm going to have to delete that, and it's going to be chaotic. So I'm just going to check those folders to make sure they copied over. They're all in here. Yep. Yep, looks good. So just remember to set yourself up in the same way. Okay. Now, I created a new shadows folder, but in the file already there was a shadows folder that contained 2 shadow shapes. I can either delete the folder that I just created, or I can bring in these 2 layers by shift selecting them and then moving them into my new folder, and then deleting the old shadows folder. Okay. The reason that they're appearing on top of my cube is because my cube folder is at the very bottom. If I bring it to the top of my layer structure, it'll look back to normal. All right. Finally, I'm going to take this swatch, the smart object of my marble, and I'm going to put it in my materials folder, like so. And I'm going to drag over that swatch underneath the object. So you've probably done these steps already, which is great. Okay. What I want you to check, though, is maybe you copied them over, and then you duplicated the swatch 3 times, like by jumping it 3 times. And just remember that if you do that, all 3 are from the same smart object. So if you do an edit in one of them, all 3 of them are going to be affected. So I'm just dragging all 3 out just to show you what I mean. If I come into one of these and then make an edit, and then save it, if I go back to my other file, it'll affect all 3, okay? Now, we don't want this because we want to change the brightness of each one of them individually. But to correct this, it's very simple, all right? So if you haven't done this yet, the easy fix right now is to start with your first material, right-click on that smart object in your layers palette and say new smart object via copy. Remember what this does? It takes all the same information, but it makes a second instance. So now they're separate from each other. So when we go into one of them, we can edit it individually. So I'm going to do this twice. So I have 3 versions. I'm going to rename them Marble Right and Marble Top. Okay? Now, if you didn't do this and you go into your smart object and you see that they're all linked, all you have to do is don't re-import them in. Maybe you already resized it. Just select that smart object and just right-click on it and do the same thing, saying new smart object via copy, and delete the original one. All right? Because whenever you do this, then you break that link, and now all 3 are separate. So if you've already placed them in your file and you've already sized them, just go to those layers and make sure that you select this to make a duplicate of it, but now it's broken from the original. Okay? Lucas.
Is the link below like the chain icon?
No, it's not linked via this. It's just a attribute of smart objects. By definition, all smart objects, if you copy them by just doing Command J to jump it,
yeah,
it'll.
But if I did Command V.
Command paste like V,
yeah.
Then it's the same thing. It's you've taken the same instance and then placed it again. All right, and you can test this by going into the smart object and doing a small edit to see if they're all affected the same way. And if they are, just don't resize it or redo it. Just right-click on it and just say New Smart Object via copy. Okay? And so I'm going to resize all 3 of these, starting from the front. I'll hit Command T. Whoops. I'll hit Command T. I distort it into place by holding Command and then bringing it to its corners to match the perspective. I hit Return to commit that, and then I hit Command T to scale it back up again, because I want to use a portion of the material and not the whole material squeezed into one surface. If I use the whole material squeezed into one surface, and I do it on all 3 sides, the pattern's going to look the same on all sides. It's going to look fake. So to demonstrate that, let me just go to my cube folder, and I'm going to take this front layer. I'm going to hide the back layer, and I'm going to lower the opacity of the front layer so you can see it. All right? So you see through the cube, and you see that material there. It's important that we distort the material first to the perspective of the cube, because if we don't do that and we just do something like this, even though it's a very random material, it still has a perspective to it. It still has some sort of direction or plane to it. And if we distort it out of perspective, like this random, with marble, you can get away with it. It's very cloudy, it's very organic. But with things like wood, with fabric, like when you see a section that's being pulled out of scale or out of proportion, it'll affect the way that we perceive that perspective. So it's always best to start by bringing it corner to corner, committing that, and then I'm going to resize it. So Command T again, And I'm actually going to do this through my top options menu here. Where I see width and height, I'm going to link them together by clicking on that icon between them. And then I'm going to increase the width to 75%, all right, to get this attribute. So we talked about smart objects last week. I told you that if you resize something as a smart object and then scale it back up, it'll preserve its resolution. It'll only preserve its resolution up to 100%, okay? Once you go past 100% for anything, Photoshop will have to make up information. So just remember that. You can't scale something past 100% and expect it to look crisp. Once you go past 100%, Photoshop is creating information that doesn't exist, and so you're gonna get pixelation. So I'm gonna keep this to 75%. I just want enough of it so that I can see half of it is gonna sit on the surface, so that I'll use the other half on the right surface. So I'm gonna take this left bottom section and place it there. I'm gonna hit return. And then I'm going to mask this off. So I didn't create my paths for marble yet. Let me go ahead and do that. Actually, I'm not going to create the paths. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to take, let me distort everything first, and then I'll do the paths. So I'm going to hide the layer of marble front. I'm going to show marble right, and I'm going to do the same thing really quickly. I don't have to explain this. Command T, whoops. Command T, Command and distort into place. Okay. Return, Command T, scale it up, 75% for myself. That's what I want. I'm going to take the right corner this time and then bring it over. Okay. I'm going to hide that. I'm going to show the top, do the same thing, Command T. Distort into place. And then resize. In this case, the width and the height are drastically different percentages. What I'll do is I'll scale each of them individually. I'm going to double 32 to 65, and I'll double 17.75 to 40. So I'll just do 65 and 40. 65 and 40, okay? And I can do them individually by unlinking them. That link icon in the middle maintains the proportion. So if I have it enabled, if I change one of the attributes, the other will change dynamically. But if I unlink them, then I can change each one individually. So I just did that there. And I'm going to take this back right section and move it into place. Okay. Now I didn't create paths for this yet, and you may have, so sorry. And I didn't mask this out yet because I want this marble cube to have a little bit of deformation. I don't want it to be perfect. I want it to have a little bit of a rough edge around its contour to look like it's been chiseled out of rock, okay? So it's not a clean, clean, clean shape. And so before I create my paths, I'm gonna make that mask first. All right, how are we going to do this? Let me open up that cube folder again that contains all my different sides. I'm going to increase the front cube back to 100% so I can see the cube fully, okay? I want to see the cube in its full opacity because I want to be able to cleanly select this top surface using my magic wand tool. So I'm going to take my magic wand tool, I'm going to be on this front cube layer, and I'm going to select that top layer, okay? Now again, I'm not going to make the mask yet because I want to paint away the edge of the mask or the path before I commit it to memory. So just by selecting the top with my magic wand, I'll go back to my marble top in my materials, and I'll add the layer mask just to start, okay? I don't see it anymore because the front cube is on top of it, and if I hide it, you'll see that it's cleanly cut into place. So I'm gonna do this for the other two sides. I'm gonna select the front side, oh, nope. I'm gonna go to my front layer, I'm going to select the front face. I'm going to go back down to my marble front material, and I'm going to add the layer mask. Once more with the right side, I'm going to go to my front cube, use my magic wand tool, select the right side. go to my marble right material, and then add the layer mask. Okay? You don't see anything because, again, the front cube is on top. If I hide it, you see that all 3 sections have been cropped cleanly. But it's a very, very clean silhouette. It's not this effect that I have here, where it's a bit roughed up, like rock, okay? So I'm gonna wanna rough up each of these masks first. One thing that I'll also do is I'll also take the opportunity to move around the material so that it makes a little bit more sense. Like you see in the center here, I have these 2 dark spots. It'd be nicer if they actually lined up and they blended into each other to make one uniform shape. So I can do that. I can go into my marble front. I can take the material itself and I can shift it down. But right now it's linked, if you look at my layers panel, it's linked to the mask, meaning if I move it, I'm gonna move the mask as well. If I only wanna move the material inside of it, I just have to click on that link between them to break the link. And this way the mask is gonna stay in its place, but the material can be moved. So I'm gonna move this material down by holding shift, so that dark spot lines up with the left side. And it just looks a little, I don't know, like something. It looks like something. We did a thing, okay? I'm gonna check the top as well and see if there's a nice area that lines up. I could bring this shape over and maybe it'll come over on top of this shape. So let me just try that out right now to see what that looks like. Again, to move the material but to keep the mask in place, you have to delink them or unlink them. Then you can select the material thumbnail, take your move tool, and then slide it over. Yeah. Okay. Careful that you don't slide it over. You see what's happening on my top left edge? You know, I only have so much material. If I bring it over too much, I have empty space there. That's because my material swatch ends at that space. So just make sure that you have enough to cover everything. And that looks really nice on the edges. So when I'm happy at that, I'll relink all 3 to the mask again. So far, so good? Cool. So make sure you're happy with your base before you start painting, because now we're going to get into the real business. I want to rough up the edges of this. I don't want it to be so clean. So what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to go into the mask of each of these layers, each of these sides, and with a chisel brush, or because I don't have my chisel brush made, and I don't want to spend time doing that, I'm going to just take my stylized block 2, and I'm just going to go across the edge to just rough up the surface a little bit, the silhouette, so that it looks a little bit more like this, a little bit more like chiseled rock being cut out of a bigger marble stone. So I'm only doing this around the whole contour of the object, maybe a bit on the bottom too, which is not here in this case, but definitely along the outer sides. So go ahead and do that too with me. You're gonna do this side by side. So starting from the front, you're only gonna paint along the left edge. You'll take your chisel brush or your stylized block 2, aim for a proportion that's like, remember that whatever size brush you have is going to sort of show how chiseled it is. So too small and it just looks like really crumbly. Too big, it could be nice to start with. It'll look like a clean cut through, but maybe something medium in proportion, like about a 5th or 6th, 1, 2, 3, yeah, 6th of the height of the actual cube. All you're gonna do is, for my case, I'm gonna subtract some of the information. So with this black brush, this black square brush, I'm gonna come really close to the edge in the mask. Make sure you're in the mask. And just paint close to the edge. That's way too much. But even if you mess it up, you can just invert it with a white brush. So this is way too large right now. And also you should do this with full opacity and full flow. You don't want there to be any transparency on this. You want it to be like cut. It shouldn't be like faded. That doesn't make any sense. So this is too much. So I'm gonna come back with white and redo that with a smaller brush. Again, just traveling right over that edge. And you see that I'm going outside of that information. That's not good either. Okay. To control that, I'll just revert. To make sure that I'm not showing too much information or taking away too much information, I'm going to create a selection for this. So I have a mask, right? I'm gonna select that mask by hitting Command and selecting the mask itself. And this way I have a selection across the whole face. Yes, Alessandro, 1 second. And because I have this selection enabled, if I paint with white, I won't show any marble outside of that selection. So it'll keep me from making like too much of a corner come out. Alessandro?
So when you paint, you paint inside, not outside? So it
Yeah.
stays within the
Exactly. Paint on the inside of the cube and not the outside. Because if you paint on the outside of the cube, you're going to start to affect the perspective of the cube. Okay? So you either want to subtract information from the cube and bring it back if you lose too much of it, but you want to stay within this square shape. So that's why I'm making the selection first. A reminder how to do that. I have a mask that's there already. I'm going to hit Command and click on that mask to make that selection. And if I want to hide the selection but keep it enabled, you hit Command H so that you don't see it if it's distracting for you. So for me it is, I'm gonna hide it, but it's still there. So if I go back with my black brush and then come over that edge, I'm gonna eat away at it, coming in and out, okay? And if I wanna bring some more back, I'm gonna switch back to white and just bring in a little bit. But because my selection is there, I'm not going outside of that initial square. So you're going to want to do that with all 3 faces. You can do it across the bottom too, a little bit. But just don't get too carried away with it, all right? It's a natural material that's cut with a machine, so it should still, like the goal is that it looks clean, but of course it's imperfect. So you're just aiming for a bit of imperfection rather than completely random. Right. So I'm going to do this in all 3 of the masks. This time I'm going to go from the top mask. Again, I'm going to start with a selection. So I'm selecting the mask itself. I'm going to hide my selection with Command H. And then I'm going to go across the edge, the outer edge, with black first. Just really close. And if I make a mistake, it's fine, because I can always bring it back with white. So I'm moving in and out. I'm going to round out the back corner. I'm going to come back in. Okay, and I'm going to round out the top corner, and if I feel like I've lost too much, I'm going to come back with white and just paint in some more information. Okay. Same thing with the right side. Make the selection first of the mask. So you stay within that shape. I'm going to hide the selection with Command H, coming with black. I'm going to brush away some of that. And the only rule here is that you make sure your corners are touching. Your top corner and your right corner are touching each other. Maybe that's a bit much. Come back. Bring back some of that information. Maybe a little bit at the bottom, just rounding out the bottom corner a little bit. I should do that on the other side as well. I'm going to go back into my front and just round out that corner. What you don't want is this. You don't want the 2 planes to be different shapes. So I'm going to round this corner out a little bit to match. So I'm back in my front mask with a black brush. Just going to round this out so it matches a bit. Okay, I'm gonna come back out and see what that looks like. Okay, so we just roughed it up a bit. All right. When you're happy with the shape is now when you save all of these paths, okay? Because you have them here in each of these masks. So I didn't do it originally because if I saved the original paths, they would have been the clean rectangles. But when I apply painting or effects, I want them to be clean cut to this new shape. I want to consider the information that I took away and added. So now is when I'm going to save these selections as paths. So starting with my top, I'll select the top mask by hitting Command and then clicking on the thumbnail of the mask. And now I have this very rough selection, which I'm going to save as a path. So in my Paths panel, I'll go to the bottom and I'll make a work path from the selection and I'll just rename it. Okay. This is my marble top. And I'll do the same thing for the right and the front. I'm going to select the right side, rename it, save it, marble right, and the front side, create a path, save it, marble front. Okay, so now I have all three in here. Sorry, that was number 3. All right. Now remember that by doing so, I've also changed the silhouette path. Before I had this path here, 03 marble, which looks like this, okay? It's that very clean blue shape. And you see that it's no longer true to the object. So what I'll do is I'll delete that path, because it doesn't make any sense anymore. And I'll select these 3 new paths that I created to create a silhouette path. Following along? So I'm going to hit Command on marble top, and then to add a selection to this, within my Paths panel, I'll hit Command again, but hold Shift at the same time. Shift is always adding to your selection. So if I hold Shift and then select marble right and marble front, I'll have created a clean path of all of my information that's been roughed up, and I can save this new path for the silhouette of my block. So at the very bottom of my Paths panel, I'm going to make a work path from this selection and call it 03 marble. Yes, Lucas?
I'm trying to paint with the layer mask, but it paints gray, but not, like I can't change the mask now.
Say again? Just make sure that you select that shape first so you don't go outside of it. Command and then click on that. Command, and then click on the thumbnail. No, not a mouse. The black with the mouse. There you go. And now you can outside.
Oh, so I don't go outside of it?
Paint inside of it.
Okay.
Just take away some information, but never outside.
Alright.
You want to have this information? Yeah, it's just something that happened. Okay, very good. But then just select that clear side. Yeah. Okay, so while you're doing that, I'll go through the steps again. The 11 steps that you need to consider. the first thing that we need to do is think about the 1, 2, 3 read. All right? No matter what the material, even if it's very transparent, even if you can see through it, there still needs to be a slight variation of contrast here. We need to have a differentiation between the top side, the left side, and the right side. And it was a common comment that I gave to people in their mouse rendering. It's just making sure that you have 3 distinct planes. Even in a sphere, even in a ball, like we still have a highlight zone, a dark zone where there's shade, and we still have a midtone, right? We always want at least 3 separations to create this read of form. So in a cube, it's much easier. We just have to make a differentiation between the top, the front, and the right, okay? So you're gonna go into each smart object and adjust the brightness. But one thing that you wanna consider again is the halfway to black rule. If we make the right side too dark, it's not gonna look like the same color of the rest of the marble. It's gonna look like it's been burned or dirty. So I'll do a little visual guide here. You could always do this too, but I'm just gonna go on a separate layer outside of everything. I'm gonna create a little rectangular selection and put a gradient in there. So the gradient I'm gonna put in is just a default gradient. I'm gonna press D on my keyboard. I'm gonna hit reverse so that it goes from white to black, just for me. And I'm gonna go from end to end, so I have this gradient in place. Okay. Da, da, da. That way I can check my values. I'm going to open this up in a new window. So window, arrange, new window. So I have that second window here, all right? Now let me close all of these layer files. Don't save, don't save, don't save. And I'm going to arrange them 2 up. Okay. I'm doing this because I want to check the values in grayscale in this bottom one. So remember to set the view mode of this to grayscale. I just go to Window? No, View. View, Proof Setup, Custom. The first 2 options there. And the device to simulate should be set to gray gamma 1.8. 1.8, and hit OK. And that'll show this to me in grayscale. Okay. I'm just doing that because when I change the brightness of this right side, I don't want it to be darker than 50% black, all right? If we agree that the marble is white, then I don't want these white values in the stone. To be darker than halfway to black. So what's halfway to black here? It's 50% gray. So the brightness of this side shouldn't be darker than 50% gray. Okay? So I'll go into the smart object of my right side by double-clicking on the smart object icon here for my marble right. That'll open up the material separately. And then I'll put on curves, I'll put on brightness contrast to lower the brightness of this. I think it's just better to do this via your curves here. So I already have a curves adjustment open. I'm going to delete that and then redo it with you. What you should do is in your layers panel, add in an adjustment. At the very bottom of your layers panel, you'll see that half circle icon, and you can select curves, or you can just go to your adjustments panel and select the curves adjustment, and then bring that in. The properties window should open up, and you should see the curve of your material, all right? What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna lower the white value down to about 1/3. maybe about halfway, maybe a little bit higher than halfway to start. I'm going to bring the black value in to darken the darks. Okay. And I'll just save this to see what happens. So I'm going to hit Command S to save it. I'll see what it looks like in my grayscale preview, and I'll be able to compare it to my values. So does this value here match my 50% gray here? All right, it's pretty close. When I eyedrop this and then paint it next to it, it's not bad. At least it's not darker than 50%, and that's what I want. I don't want it to be darker than halfway to black. If the side was this dark, it would just be too burnt out. It would be too caustic for that material. So I'm going to stay with that adjustment, all right? I'm going to do the same thing with the front side. What I want is a good 1, 2, 3 read. So I want halfway in between this top and this right. If the top is my brightest surface and the right is my darkest surface, I want this front side to be somewhere in the middle. So I'm going to close this material. I've already saved it. And I'm going to double click on the smart object for my front. I'm going to do the same thing. Ooh. Let me just bring this up into here so I can see it. Yeah. Either in my layers panel, let me delete this curve adjustment. Either in my layers panel at the very bottom, I can select the half circle to select curves, or in my adjustments panel, I can just select the curves adjustment. It's that graph looking icon, the third one on the top row. And for this case, I'm going to do not quite as much. So if in my other one I went halfway down and halfway to the right, I'm only going to go a quarter of the way. Okay. I'll hit Command S to save the smart object, and I should see it update dynamically in my value scale, my value test. Okay. Right now, my front side looks too similar to my right side. I don't think it's different enough. I don't think it's a solid 2 in the 1, 2, 3 read. So I've made this too dark. I'm going to bring back my curves in this file. I'm going to take maybe the middle section. So I'm going to put a little dot here, a little point here in the middle, and I'm going to bring that curve a little bit higher up. And this will open up the space for more whites or more brightness to exist. So I have a slight roundness to that curve. And I'm going to hit Command S. Okay? And so now I have a better 1, 2, 3 read. The top surface is clearly brighter than the front surface, which is clearly brighter than the right surface. If anything, I can make the right surface a little bit darker. All right? So that's very easy to do. I'll just close this smart object, go back to the outside of my file, go to my right side. My curves are still there. I can still darken this a little bit more just by just moving the blacks closer in and bringing the whites lower. Command S. And there we go. Now I have a very solid 1, 2, 3 read. The whites on my right side aren't darker than 50% black. All of the rules of light are being obeyed. I'm good. I can continue on. So I'm going to close the smart object now. I'm going to look at my colored version. I'm going to have my grayscale version here, and I can continue on with painting. Okay, what's next in our checklist? Light decay, shadow edges, reflective highlight, crevice shadow. Very simple. Light decay is just the notion that when we have a source of light, the further we are away from that light source, of course, the light is getting weaker and weaker. So even on a flat surface, like the top of this cube, if our light source is at the top left and it's hitting this top, even if the power of the light is very strong and has a strong or very low light decay, the part that's closer to the light source will be just a little bit lighter than the part that's further away from it. It's going to get a little less bright on the top surface, okay? So what we're going to do is just on the top surface and then on the sides, we're going to create a bit of a gradient. So I have a folder inside of my material that I said is called light decay. We created these from the beginning. I'm going to create a new layer inside of light decay. And I'm going to select the shape of the top of my cube. I can either do that by selecting the mask from my materials or by selecting the path that I created earlier. By hitting Command and selecting marble top. Where is it? Oh, I'm in this file, okay. Marble top, there we go. I'll have cleanly selected that top plane, and I'm just gonna put in a gradient here. I'm gonna take my gradient tool. I can set it from white to black. And then from the left to the right, I'm just gonna put in this, okay? I'm gonna set the blending mode of this layer to multiply. Maybe, yeah, multiply, yep. I'll press Command H to hide the selection right now. It's really rough, it's really, really fake looking. The opacity is too high. I'm gonna lower it to 20%, just to give that little bit of dimness on the right side compared to the left side. Okay, without it, it's more flat, it's all blown out. On the right side, there's just a little bit of light decay on the surface of that. If it's still too much, we can go to 15. We can even go to 10. Anything lower than 10 and it's kind of useless. It fulfills some sort of purpose, okay? If you're not happy with the gradient and it's too dim on the left side, you could always adjust the gradient by bringing it in a little bit more on the left side and then coming out. Well, we just want that darkness. We can do the same thing on the left wall and the right wall as well. So I'm going to rename this one top. I'm going to create a new layer. And for the front side, I'll select that path again. By going to my paths panel, I'll just hit Command and select marble front to select that shape. And then again with my gradient tool, from top to bottom, I'll just put in this gradient here. Okay. I set it as a radial gradient. It shouldn't be that. It should be a linear gradient. So make sure you check that. I'm going to undo. And instead, I'm going to put this in as a linear gradient from top to bottom, something like this. Okay. Again, set it to multiply, to darken, to take away all the white and just leave the black, and then lower the opacity to something much more subtle. Okay. What does it look like without that? It looks like this. Okay. When I bring it in, I have a sense of light decay, but I'm also bringing in some occlusion. And I'll talk about that in a bit. If it's coming up too high, if that darkness is coming up too high, just take your gradient and do it again, starting the gradient much more lower on the wall, and then bringing it down. Okay? You just want that hint of darkness at the bottom. And I can call that front. If I really wanted to, I could do it on the right side. It doesn't make sense to do it on the right side, though. Why? Because there's no light on that right side. That right side is on shade. So to put light decay on the right side wouldn't make any real sense. Okay? Next step, shadow edges. Okay. Remember this? The difference between hard and soft light? Okay. When we have hard light, we see hard shadows, meaning we see a very clean shape of the shadow. When we have soft light, those shadows become blurred out. They become very hazy. Okay. Now, when we're trying to communicate the form of an object, it's usually better to cast hard light onto angular forms because the shadow shape respects the form of the volume and it makes it easier to read. So we want to have hard light for this cube. Now you have shadows here already in place, but maybe they're just a bit too hard. So we can talk about painting them now, but let's leave that to the very end, okay? Because we've already drawn these out, they're already in place. You could get away with leaving them as is. We'll decide later on whether to paint a bit of them out based on reflected light and on surface scattering. Okay, so let's skip past that step for a bit. Let's move on to reflective highlight, crevice shadow, ambient occlusion. Let me just see my notes here. Reflective highlight and mask. Okay, reflective highlight we'll put in later. Crevice shadow, ambient occlusion, and edge light. All right. We kind of did this last week with the wood, but I'm going to do it all together with the marble. I'm going to put in the occlusion shadow, the crevice shadow, and I'm going to put in a bit of highlight on the edges, all in one step, okay? So just to remind you what we're doing here, occlusion occurs when two edges meet, two internal edges meet. So in this case, occlusion would happen in this inner edge where the object is touching the ground, okay? Here and here. Meaning we're going to see some darkness rise up onto this surface. It's just harder for light to come into here. The opposite of occlusion is this edge light. So on corners that are sticking outwards, these edges will actually receive more light, okay? So you're going to get more light hitting here, here, all along the top surface, all along this front edge, and these side edges, because all of these edges are protruding outwards, okay? And then finally, you have the crevice shadow. And the crevice shadow is the shadow that sits underneath the object that separates it from the ground. Everything in our environment has this. Anything that is detached has a little black line underneath it. It's the darkest shadow, it's the darkest part of occlusion in our object. So we're going to do all three of these steps in one go, and then we're going to paint them out. And then we're going to take a break. Okay. So for this, I'm going to need to bring back that front cube. So I'm going to need to bring this back. Go ahead and find it in your layers, and make sure that you have it visible. We're going to do this through 3 layer styles. When you find this layer, double click on it, not on the thumbnail and not on the name, but in the just space itself to get the layer style window. The 3 effects that we're going to add to this are a drop shadow, an inner shadow, and an inner glow. Okay? So starting with the occlusion, we're going to go to inner shadow and add that. And what we want is we want this darkness around the edges. We did this last week with the wood, but I went through it very fast, so I'm going to go through it again. We just want a soft haze of darkness to come up onto the surface here. So you can set, you want to leave the blend mode to multiply because you want it to darken, but you can set the color to something that is closer to the values or the hue of your material. So if I have this sort of white rock with some yellow tones to it, I'll probably pick a dark gray value, a dark warm gray as my occlusion. Okay. For its distance, you want it to come pretty high up and then paint out the information afterwards. For its angle, you want it to come from the bottom and upwards, so you want it to be -90. The choke is just how it maintains its strength all the way through. A lower choke means it fades out a lot faster. It's much, much softer. A higher choke means that it stays thick and dense for a lot more space. So we want something in between. We want a nice fade, something soft. So I have 7% here. And the size, just how deep does it go into the object. So we want a pretty high size, because we just want enough information there so that when we mask it out, we can take away. So we want to start with a lot. Okay. So my values in my case are 47 pixels, 7% choke, 224 size. But what you're really aiming for is something that just looks nice and soft coming in. Okay. The second effect that we're going to do is the opposite of occlusion. It's the edge light. So for that, we're going to do an inner glow. Inner glow? Yeah, like this. Okay? So I checked off inner glow, and I'm going to go to my inner glow settings. Here again, the blend mode should stay as screen because we want this inner glow to lighten up the object. For the color, though, you can change that to something that is closer to the values of your material. So in my case, again, white rock, but has some earth tones, has some yellows, some golds in it. So I'm going to go with a warmer stone. I'm going to pick a light value here, something desaturated, but still just a little bit of a glow there. Very bright, very desaturated, just a hint of color. Okay. You want to set the source as the edge, and based on the material, you want to set either softer or precise. Okay. It's exactly what you think. If you have a very soft material, like fabric, like we're going to do later, we would pick softer. If we have a very manufactured or clean-cut object, we're going to go with precise here. All right. Now, my choke in size, again, I can bring that in, but I think my values were okay to start. So I have 35, maybe 40 as my choke, and my size, we're going to leave it at about 60. For your contour, you want it to be this first one here, just a linear transition, okay? I'll explain this more later, but it should just look like this. And all you want is a nice glowing edge along the contour and the inner edges of that object, okay? We'll paint out the bottom section of that after. Now for the drop shadow. Drop shadow is very simple. All you're going to do is select it. Right now my angle is -90, which is making it go upwards. Okay? Drop shadow means to drop from the direction that it's aiming at. So if I want to aim downwards, I have to aim my angle up. So my angle is going to be 90 degrees. It's going to force the drop shadow downwards. And I just want to see a nice black line underneath there. If it looks like it's too low, you can adjust the distance, maybe something like 5 pixels. But you can also edit it outside of the file or in the layers afterwards. So I'm just going to leave it at 5 pixels, a spread of 10, and a size of 3. And when I'm happy with all of that, I'll hit OK. Okay. So I brought in all 3 of these effects. They're there, but I don't want them to be all over the cube like this. I want them to be in specific spots. So I'm going to have to paint some of the information out. All right. Now, this is really particular, so you're going to have to pay attention to this. Maybe even pay attention first before you do this, because I don't want to lose you with this. These effects are tied to this cube right now, this layer, if you look at my layers panel. I want them to be separated, and I want to apply them to my materials. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click on this effects, this word effects, in my layers panel, and I'm going to say create layers. This will take all 3 of those effects and put them onto separate layers that I can move around and paint in with layer masks. So I'm going to right-click and say create layers, and you see they come in as these 3 things: front inner shadow, front inner glow, front drop shadow. Okay? The front inner shadow and the front inner glow come in as clipping masks because they're clipped to the shape of the cube. The front drop shadow comes in just as a separate layer because it's just a black shape behind the cube. So I'm going to take the front drop shadow right now, and I'm going to go put that into my shadow subfolder right away. So my front drop shadow, I'm just going to take it and drag it into my shadows folder, and now it's there. If I hide my shadow subfolder, all the shadows will disappear on my object. That one's pretty simple. For my front inner shadow and my front inner glow, I want them to clip to the cube, but I want them to clip to the cube of my materials. So I'm going to take these 2 layers, inner shadow and inner glow. I'm going to drag them above my materials folder here. But as soon as I do so, it breaks the clipping mask because I've taken it away from its original object. All right? I'm going to have to redo that clipping mask. So first, I'm going to hide this front cube so I can see my material. And then, making sure that those 2 effects are above my materials subfolder, I'm going to right-click on each of them and say Create Clipping Mask. So it clips to the whole folder underneath it. Same thing with inner shadow. Create clipping mask. Okay? So let me hide the inner glow so you can just see the shadow that's there. All right? Now you see that I have some darkness going outside of my object. That's because I used the front cube, which was clean to begin with, to make that inner shadow. If I wanted to crop to the shape of my new marble cube perfectly, I'm going to select the path of this cube, which is in here, that I had done before, by hitting Command and clicking on that thumbnail, and then adding a layer mask to front inner shadow. Oh, my drop shadow is also, okay, 1 second. My drop shadow is also this whole big black shape, okay? I just want this bottom portion. So for my drop shadow, I'm also gonna add a layer mask. And for this, I'm gonna use my polygonal lasso tool, and I'm just gonna select the bottom portion of this drop shadow, because this is the portion that I wanna stay visible. So I'm gonna make this triangular selection, and then hit layer mask for the drop shadow. So I only show this part. Okay. When I bring back my materials and I bring back my inner shadow, it should just be occlusion along the whole contour of this object. Okay. The thing is though, I don't want occlusion all around the object. I only want occlusion on the bottom of the object. So I'm gonna have to go into this mask with a black brush, a soft round brush, a soft round pressure opacity brush, something with some sort of shape dynamics, set to black, large size, low flow, and I'm gonna have to brush away that occlusion from the top, leaving it only at the bottom of the object. Again, I don't like to see my selection, so I hide it with Command H, and I'm just painting away the occlusion from the top of the object and down the front edge. So the occlusion should only exist on the bottom corners, the bottom edges touching the floor. So if I hide this, you're seeing the darkness only appear there. Okay. If it's too strong, I can always lower the opacity of the whole thing by 20% to get to 80%, but I do want to see that darkness rise up. Okay, it might be a bit much. Maybe 50 is just fine. Same idea for the inner glow. If I bring that back, it's glowing everywhere and it's super intense. So I'm going to want to clip that, first of all, to the cube by selecting the shape of the cube from my marble path, adding a layer mask so it cuts cleanly, and then taking a soft pressure opacity brush. I can even lower the opacity of this brush too. So 30-30. And again, I don't want any glow at the bottom, so I'm just going to start by erasing that. And I want to soften it towards the edges. So I'm just working the sides inwards. I'm even going over the edges themselves. In the back here, it's a bit too strong. It should be at its brightest on the top edges, okay? So on the sides, facing the light source, it catches. In the back, I'm gonna erase that too. On the top, a little bit more subtle towards the right. Its brightest is gonna be here from the top left edges, okay? Because it's the edges that are facing my light source. So I'm going to just erase some of this and make it more subtle here. If you're really critical of this, if you consider the way that your stone is chopped, then you should actually understand that some of these chisels or pieces are facing towards the light source more than others. So in this curve here, this top part of the curve, this bottom part of the curve is actually facing the light source. So I should actually have a bit more light hit that section. Okay, so I'm going to increase my flow and opacity here. I'm going to bring back some of that glow to this part and to this part that are facing up and towards my light source. Okay, so those will glow a little bit. Same thing here and here. Okay. Really, there shouldn't be very much at the back at all, because it's not facing the light. And really none at the bottom, because that's being eaten up by occlusion. Now, if you feel like your crevice shadow, that's that black shadow underneath, is too strong, you can always go to that layer and then move it around. Just selecting your move tool, I can shift it up with my arrow key to make it thinner. Or I can bring it down to make it more apparent. Okay. You just want to see a sliver of it, just to separate it from the ground, just like that. We don't want to leave this cube looking so sharp like this. It doesn't make much sense. We're going to have to rough this up a bit and paint over it to chisel that edge as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my 3 material layers, marble top, right, and front, and I'm going to duplicate them by hitting Command J. So I have 3 copies, and I'm going to merge these 3 together. Okay? So I have one clean cube on top of everything. It's not a smart object. It's been fully rasterized. I'm just taking the information to smudge it. So because I want to soften up some of this texture, on this new layer, which I'm going to move into reflective highlights up here, like this. And I'm actually going to move the reflective highlights layer below light decay, like this. Oh, wait. What have I done? Let's put this. Where should this go? 1 second. No, let me leave that in materials. I'm going to leave that layer in materials. I'm just going to rename it Soften Edge. Okay. I'll take my smudge tool. That's in your tools panel on the left side. And I'm just going to smudge over the edge. It's going to look weird at first, but then we're going to paint over it to just paint over with some white to give it a reflective highlight. I'm just going to smudge over that edge. So with a soft, round brush, I'm going to come over the area, the edge where the 2 surfaces meet. I'm just going to smudge the texture together to soften up the edge itself. So you're taking away that like pixelated angle, all right? So remember that this is on a new layer. All the materials have been merged. And you're just smudging the connection so that it's not so pixelated or digital looking. And you're doing it in small pieces. You're not doing it as one straight line. I'm not going from top to bottom in one big smudge. I'm like smudging it from side to side. So it's like we're rounding out the edge. It's like you're physically sculpting the edge to be rounded. I'm not just going from the top to the bottom and just doing one straight smudge. I'm going from left to right and blurring the line between the 2 planes. So already, that's creating a bit of deformation, a bit more of a chisel along the edge. So it looks a little softer. Okay. Now I have some strange artifacts here that's coming from the clipping mask of my inner glow and my inner shadow on top of my softened edge. I'm just going to go back to each of those masks and make sure that I erase any of this information here. So this little darkness that I have on my right side, that's clearly the darkness from my inner shadow. I'm going to come back and just make sure that I don't have that. And for my inner glow, I'm going to make sure that glow comes up. Sorry, I got distracted. Okay, but I just wanted to soften that edge. That was the main point of that. Sorry, I got distracted. It's my ADHD speaking. I just wanted to soften that edge there, okay? Just the sponge tool. And you can leave it there like that, but the thing is that if you edit one of the smart objects underneath it, you won't see the effect because the whole cube up here is on top of it, okay? So what I would do is I'd actually put a layer mask on this and erase all of the information, only keeping that edge. So what I'll do is I'll create a mask on the softened edge layer. I'll take my polygonal lasso tool and I'll just select this weird Y shape that makes the inner edges like this, okay? That way, if I want to change the smart object underneath it, it'll still be visible and affect it. I'm only keeping the smudged portion of the edge as part of my layer mask. So I actually want to delete this layer mask. You want to make the selection first and then add the layer mask, like so. And you don't have to do this. I'm just going to show you for demonstration purposes. The only part that exists on that layer is this portion here, this red portion here. Okay. Did I lose anyone with that? You did? Oh, you're okay. Okay. We just want to smudge those internal edges. On top of that, we could also paint in a little bit of white or reflective highlight. So that's what I'm going to do in this subfolder here called reflective highlights. I'll create a new layer. And I'm just going to take either your chisel brush or the stylized block brush, the same brush you used to change the mask. And I'm just going to click. I'm going to use my mouse for this, just from the left corner to the center. So you click once, hold shift, and then click again to just create a straight line. Same thing from the center to the right. Click, hold shift, click to the right. And then for the straight line going down the front, holding shift, I'll just drag down. Okay? Now this is not looking very good right now. What you have to do is switch it maybe to soft light or to screen. Let's do screen. Let's lower the opacity down to 50. And we're going to add a layer mask to that. And we're going to take away some of that information from the right edge and from the front edge. And on the left edge, we're just going to decrease it by a little bit. So I'm going to take a soft brush in this layer mask. Okay. And I'm just going to narrow it out on the top right. So I'm just doing a little bit more reflective highlight on the edges. So I'm just eating away at that stroke that I just did down the front side. A little bit on the left side. Okay. You really want this highlight to sit nicely on the corner. So I'm using a really small brush for this. But the concentration of that highlight should be on the corner there. And then on this left top edge, that highlight should really be there too. So I'm just gonna paint away this. And I'm gonna fade out that hard edge on the mask, like so. So you're gonna get a nice reflected highlight on the edge surface, like that. So we're just fading that out. Okay. And if I wanna bring more to the front, I'm gonna go with a really small brush, switch it back to white, and bring back that highlight on the front edge to certain areas. I actually like that shape. I'm gonna paint that all white here. So these little white shapes look like just chunks or chips in the rock. In the same way that it's chipped on the side, it should be chipped on the front surface as well. So your edge geometry. Okay. So that's my reflective highlight. It's just these white highlights sitting on the very tips of the object. Where are we at now? Reflected light, subsurface scattering, rim light, and reflections. 4 more things. Reflected light. Okay, very simple. When we think about reflected light, we have to think about light hitting the object and then bouncing off. So light's gonna hit this wall and then bounce down to the ground. Because the stone is white, what should happen here is we should see a bit of a white glow on the floor. We also need to think about light hitting the ground and then bouncing back up to the object. So we've already done this with occlusion. There's already some darkness here, so adding more darkness doesn't make sense. We could get a little bit of a glow right next to the bottom of the object here. So we can imagine that some of the floor, because it's a very light ground, maybe there's just a little bit of a glow at the very bottom of the object. So it's going to go from, light to dark. And then maybe here it's like a mid-tone, like we have in a ball, how at the very bottom of it there's a little bit of lightness. Okay. But we also can assume that some light is going to hit the ground and then bounce back up onto just this part of the back wall. So maybe there's a little bit of reflected light in this section. Not too far in, not here, because this is shaded, so we can't bounce shade back onto the object. That would just be bouncing darkness. But maybe just this portion of the right corner is getting a little bit of light in perspective, hitting just this portion of the right side, okay? Let's do from the cube to the ground, and then from the ground to the cube. So I should have a subfolder here that we created at the beginning called reflected light. In it, I'm going to add in a new layer. Eep. Window arranged. How are my values doing? Values looking good. All right. Let's see here. I feel like this layer should be below everything. Okay, from the cube to the ground, we're going to put this in reflection. So we're actually going to do this reflected light from the cube to the ground in the reflection layer. All I'm going to do in this new layer within reflection as my subgroup is that I'm going to create just this little pool like we did with the balls. Okay? So I just took my elliptical marquee tool, I made a little ellipse shape. I'm going to take my gradient tool. I'm going to switch it to the default black and white by pressing D on my keyboard. And then I'm going to go from somewhere around where the cube touches the ground outwards, but in a radial gradient. So undo, switch that to radial, and with white going to black, I should have something like this. Okay. I'm going to switch that blending mode of this layer to multiply. No, sorry, to screen. Soft light. Soft light. Soft light. And I'm going to add a layer mask to this, and of course just paint out all of the stuff that I don't need. So in this reflection layer, layer mask on top of this gradient, soft brush, soft opacity. Does anyone like doing this? Is this fun for you? No? This is well, you're welcome. Are we learning anything?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, sometimes learning is boring. As you should. Sometimes, no, not boring, painful. Sometimes learning is painful. But what does pain bring? What? Sometimes. Sometimes learning. But with pain comes growth, right? Evolution. So what am I doing here? I'm just going to leave that small portion of white in the front. All right? You know, in the grander scheme of things, I would hope that you take this forward into like, you know that painting you're going to have to do for Ed? Did he say that? Your 3D model of the cathedral? You're going to have to matte paint it, right? Are you working on the model right now? Yeah. I'm pretty sure you're going to have to matte paint over it. And so I'm going to want you to remember some of these tricks, especially smart objects. Okay. A lot of you are going to want to put in like flags or materials on the floor. If you build them flat and then bring them as smart objects, you don't have to worry about your perspective. You just distort them into place. You can edit them separately. Anyway, I'll help you with that later when it comes. All right, does anyone know what I just did there? Did that make sense? I just painted in the mask to go from this. I painted it black to take away all that extra information, leaving just this little white glow there. I could have just painted that, to be perfectly honest. That would have made sense too.
You could have also just used a gradient from white to transparent.
I could have used white to transparent, but I still want to control where that reflected light is going, okay? Don't get it twisted. I don't want reflected light onto this right side. So even if you do paint it, control it so that it's only reflecting off of the left walls onto the left ground, okay? So that's from the object to the environment. Now the inverse of that is the environment to the object. And this one I'm going to paint in the reflective light layer because it's going to be on top of everything. All right. And for this case, what I'll do is I will select the shape of my cube because this reflected light should stay inside of the cube. So where's that path? It's here at the bottom of my paths panel. Command select. I can do a gradient again. I can select the color of the environment. It shouldn't really matter. It could be white as well. And in this shape, I can just make a gradient from the bottom going up. This one I'm going to want to do linearly, not radially. Like so. So I just have a little bit of light gray coming up on the object. And this one I want to set to soft light as well. Okay. It's going to blow out the top surfaces. Again, what you need to do is you need to paint out the mask. So with a soft round brush in black, I'm going to paint from the top going downwards, erasing most of that top information, and along the side as well. Now, did that make any difference? A little bit. It's eating away at my occlusion though, and I don't like how much it's taking away. I'm going to lower the opacity of that to 50%. And I'm really going to paint out this right side. I just want to keep a little bit of it in the front corner. Yeah, and it's a little bit high here, so I'm just going to erase some of this. And all I have is this here. It's a little bit of reflected light. Where are we at now? Subsurface scattering, rim light, reflections. Okay. Subsurface scattering. We haven't talked about this before, but what you need to understand about subsurface scattering is that even though we understand objects to be opaque or thick or dense, not everything in our world is perfectly opaque. Like if you think about the leaves outside, and you see the light passing through them, they have some sort of transparency. So what happens, even with flesh, light enters your flesh, your skin, it is refracted inside in little molecules, and then it bounces back out. So you get a little bit of glow, especially if you hold up your hand to the light. You'll get a little bit of glow on the edges. How much glow you get depends on how transparent or how dense the object is. So like when we think about really heavy stone, we don't have as much subsurface scattering. But when we think about, like, of course, ice cubes, very low density molecular value, you'll have a lot of subsurface scattering. You'll have full transparency. You'll see light pass right through it. Okay? Marble is a little bit porous. It's not completely 100% dense. There are small holes in marble that water seeps through, that sediment, collects in. So we're going to see some of that in here. And we've already sort of done that with the edge light, the reflected light on the corners. Our marble right now looks like it's sort of glowing, right? And that already is taking into consideration subsurface scattering, okay? So just by adding in the reflective highlights, we've also addressed this idea of subsurface scattering by having some of that glow come out on the edges of the object. So we could either enhance this and bring in more of it. We can bring in some more on the right side. You could also think of it as affecting your shadow. So let me just explain that. Let me explain that. We'll do the reflections, and then we're done. Boop, boop, boop. Light is going to come in. If the object is porous, having these small little holes, light will enter the object. It'll bounce around in different directions, and it will exit the object at different points. So it'll come into the marble. Sometimes that light, a lot of that light will get absorbed, but some of that light will escape. And that's why we get a little bit of glow on the edges or on the surface, okay? Some of that light also comes out, escapes, and hits the shadow on the other side. So there's a little bit of a glow within the shadow itself. You see that a lot with, of course, transparent objects. In these materials here, meat, orange, this red thing, salmon, all of that reflected light on the other side, opposite the object, that is subsurface scattering going through the material onto the other side, eating away at the shadow. So if your material has any sort of transparency to it or is not a very dense material, then you're going to have some light enter the object and make it glow, like the salmon is kind of glowing. And also some of that light is going to escape and eat away at your shadow, okay? So even in the case of marble, it's very dense, it's a stone, it's a rock, but it is a little bit porous. So you're going to have a little bit of the shadow get eaten up, and you're going to have these glowing edges. So the glowing edges are done. What we could do, though, is we could paint a little bit of light into the shadow. So in my shadows layer, I have my 3 shadow shapes, the drop shadow, which is great, that crevice shadow, yeah. And then I have 2 shadows because it's a multiple light source system. And what I'll do is I'll just come in and paint in a little bit of glowing light this warm yellow light underneath the object. So right here with a soft brush, I'll just paint in some light. I always like to do more and then take away. Okay. I can even switch the blending mode to, oh, I painted in the shadow layer itself. I shouldn't have done that. I should have created a new layer. Let me just undo that. Create a new layer, call this SSS for subsurface scattering. Come into this and paint into the shadow a little bit. Okay. That blending mode, I'm going to switch to a lightening blending mode, something like soft light or screen. In this case, soft light. Lower the opacity. Play with the movement of it. Okay. Still very intense. It should be very, very subtle. It just needs to eat away at the shadow shape a bit. So maybe 50. Okay. It just needs to break up the inside of the shadow shape. Speaking of the shadow shape, it's a little bit harsh for my taste. You know, we put in those deformations. So I'm going to add layer mask to each of the shadow shapes. And I'm going to paint away at them too with a soft brush. I'm just going to soften the edge of each of them. And the way that I'm painting here, and be very careful with this whenever you're painting shadows across the ground. When I'm softening the edge of this shadow, I'm not going to move my brush along the edges in this direction. Okay? When I'm softening the edges of a shadow, or I'm painting in a shadow, I'm going to move in the direction of the ground. So my brushes are going to go from left to right. Okay. Why is that? Because this ground is in perspective. It's moving away from us. And if I paint along the shape of the shadow, some of my brush strokes and the way that it's fading, it'll look out of perspective. So don't follow the shape of the shadow. Instead, paint slowly left to right in this motion. So that way, if there's any sort of break in the shadow, it just looks like the floor is uneven. It looks like you're taking on the material of the ground. So let me do that here. In the shadow shape for my side shadow, I'm going to come in with my brush. Very soft brush. And I'll show you what I mean by doing it wrong first. Don't do this. Don't paint left, then right, and then like this. Okay? It may work in this case because we're dealing with a simple scene, but imagine you had a ground that was uneven and it was in perspective. You want to paint in the direction of the ground, all right, away from you. So instead I'm going to go with that soft brush, low flow, slightly lower opacity, and I'm going to paint from left to right, even along the side, just to soften that edge up a bit. I'm moving in the direction of the ground. Okay. Same thing with my back shadow. I'm painting from left to right, away from me in perspective. I still want to see the shape of the shadow because it is hard lighting. I don't want it to be this. I don't want it to be this because that's soft lighting. I still need to see the form of the shadow to some degree. I just want to soften the edge to account for subsurface scattering and for light decay. Okay, so that's fine. Where are we? Last couple things, reflection and rim light. Okay, rim light is very simple. We're just gonna put a glow behind the object because light is reflecting in the background and then coming back towards our eye. And because of that, it's making the edges of the cube illuminate a little bit more. We did this in the ball exercise as well. So for this, we're gonna go back to our front cube. Let's actually do it like this. Let's go to, we'll do it in our shadows layer, or we'll just do it behind your materials layer. So create a new layer behind materials and call it edge. Okay. I'm gonna select my marble shape, and I'm just gonna fill it with white. So I have a white fill behind everything. This fill is below my materials layer, and it's the shape of my block or my cube. Okay. And with this layer selected, but with no selection, so I'm not going to select the cube. I'm just selecting the layer itself. I'm just going to blur it outwards. So filter, blur, Gaussian blur. And I'll blur it 5 pixels, just so that I see that white halo around the cube. Okay, you see it's kind of coming out and around it. All right. So I created a white fill of the cube behind the materials. I blurred it 5 pixels, and now I'm going to commit that and paint it, because I shouldn't see this rim light at the bottom of the object, and I don't want it to be even all the way around. So with the soft brush again, I'm painting it away from the bottom. No edge light at the bottom. And I also don't want it to be even all the way throughout. I want there to be some variation. So the top, it's a little bit much. There's a lot of glowing going on here already. I don't need extra of that. Okay. This backside, it's very useful to separate it from the background. I just want to fade a little bit of it out. But that creates a nice thin white line to separate it from the background. And it serves as reflected light again. Light reflecting off of the backdrop and then coming back towards our eye to illuminate the back of the object. The last step is reflections. All right. Woo. We want to reflect the two walls, the front and the right, below it, so that the ground looks shiny. Okay, this is what finally seals the deal. This is what gets the object to look like it's part of the environment. You know, in this project that I showed you, if I do all the steps but I don't reflect the shadows or the shape of the chair into the ground, it'll look super fake. Reflections are really important with convincing people that something exists in a space, right? You have to understand that a lot of materials, even though they look matte, they have some sort of shiny quality to it. So if you're not seeing the full reflection of the object like a mirror, you'll still see reflected light, okay? But if there's no reflection of this chair into the floor, this would look clearly like a 3D model. So it's our last way to anchor the object into the environment. To do this, I'm going to take the materials that I put in, the right and the front. I'm going to duplicate them. I'm not going to create a new copy. I'm going to duplicate them by hitting Command J. Okay? Remember, by duplicating them with Command J, they're still linked, so they share the same instance, meaning that if I wanted to change the appearance of one of them, then the reflection will change as well, which is a great thing. I'm going to bring these two copies into my reflection subfolder at the very bottom of my layer structure. Okay. I'm gonna put them below the reflected light because the reflected light hits the ground and the reflection exists underneath the ground. It exists underneath everything. All right. Starting with the front copy, I'm gonna hit Command T. I'm gonna right click and then flip it vertically. Okay. I'm gonna slide this down vertically, holding Shift, matching the front corner to the front corner, like so. And I'm gonna distort this so that the left corner, the left top corner of this reflection is touching the bottom left corner of my object. So with the transformation still enabled, I'm gonna hold Command, grab the side, and then bring it up. Okay. Now the front edge will distort too. You're just gonna have to fix that by taking the side as well, holding Command, and bringing the side back down so that the edges line up. Like so. What's important is that the top edge of the reflection lines up with the bottom edge of the object. And then commit that. Chad.
Sorry, what transform tool did you use? For
Okay, I'll do it again with the right so that you see it again. So with the right side, this is my right copy for the reflection. I'm hitting Command T. It's in there somewhere, you just don't see it because it's hidden by the object. I'm gonna right click and say flip vertical. So now you see that it's been flipped. I'm gonna drag it down holding Shift so that it stays aligned, like so. To change the perspective of it, I'm gonna hold Command on my keyboard. And you see as soon as I hit Command, I can grab the right side of this and then bring it up so that the corner touches the corner. It moved the front corner as well though, so I'm gonna have to do it on the left side as well. Holding Command to do a distortion, I'm gonna drag the left side down. And I'm just gonna fix this on both sides to make sure that they're both touching. When the bottom edge touches each other, I'm gonna hit Return to Committed, all right? Now, what do I do? I could paint in each layer mask, but I don't know, I feel inspired right now. I think I could do this a little bit better. Okay, because I want the reflection to affect both sides equally, the mask that I apply is gonna be on the whole group. So I'm actually gonna take, you know that reflected light that we had here? I'm gonna take it out of this folder. I'm just gonna put it right above itself. So right between shadows and reflection. So it's not in the folder anymore. And it's not in shadows either. It's on a separate layer outside of both groups. I'm gonna apply a layer mask to the group. So that way both reflections are affected in the same way. I'll take my gradient tool, set to a linear gradient going from black to white, foreground to background in my case. That's just D on your keyboard and X to switch it. And then in this layer mask attached to the group folder, I'm gonna go from bottom to top, a little bit higher, like that. Okay. Now, this is still in perspective, so that linear gradient that I put in, it was going from top to bottom pretty flat. It came in like this. Okay? But the way the reflections work is that the distance from the material to the surface should be the same distance from the reflection to the surface. So there needs to be some sort of perspective to the reflection as well. It can't just be, you know, I'm seeing more reflection here and less reflection here. They need to be equal in height. So I'm gonna have to paint in that mask. So in the layer mask attached to that group folder, I'm gonna take that soft brush again. And on the sides, just on the sides, I'm gonna take away some of that information because that reflection is too long. So big black brush on the right side, paint away some of that reflection. so that the height of it matches the height in the front, so that this matches this. Same thing on the left side, paint away some of that information, so the clearest edge matches the front as well. Okay. So what was I doing there? Pretty simply, all I want to see in that reflection is to make sure that whatever is seen in the reflection, if this is how much of the edge is seen in the reflection, it's the same on the sides as well. The sides that are further shouldn't be longer than the sides that are in front in the reflection. They should be equal in perspective. It has foreshortening the same way that the object has foreshortening. Okay? So I just took away from the right and left side a little bit. Finally, I think this is the last thing. With reflections, when you reflect something into a mirror or into a surface, that mirror or surface it's made of something too. So it diminishes the contrast of the original. When you look into a mirror, if the mirror isn't illuminated, like you're slightly less contrasted, the blacks become lighter and the lights become darker. Okay, the overall contrast diminishes. So you're gonna wanna lower the contrast of these reflections. So on that reflection folder, add an adjustment of brightness contrast. That's the first adjustment there. What's that? Okay. And lower the contrast entirely. You can even lower the brightness by 10. So -10, and just clip it to that. Okay, that only affected my one side. I'm gonna clip it to this. I'm gonna clip it to the group, like so. There we go. Okay. Chad?
I think you lost some of us.
Okay. No worries. It's my last point, so I'm gonna make it count. Sure. Great. Okay. All right, here's the theory. When you reflect anything into any surface, so this is the original, reflecting into the water below it, okay? There's a change of values, all right? The darks inside of the object, they actually become a little bit lighter. Not as light as the object, they don't become brighter than the object. It's not like it becomes glowing. It just lightens up a little bit. And the lights in an object, they darken, okay? And because of this, because darks are lightening and because lights are darkening, the contrast is lowering. The values are getting closer and closer together. So in reflections, we have lower contrast. All right. So all I'm doing in this reflection here is I'm gonna go to that reflection folder that I just painted in. I'm gonna add in a brightness contrast adjustment, like so, just with my adjustments panel or by clicking on the adjustment option and selecting brightness contrast. And I'm gonna bring this adjustment above the reflection subfolder, like so. Okay. So I have the adjustment and then I have the folder that contains the reflection. I'm gonna clip it, create clipping mask to that folder, and I'm just gonna lower the contrast of the whole reflection. So look at my reflection in my marble right now. If I lower the contrast, both sides, the whites will become darker and the darks become lighter. If I lower the brightness, you see that they both become darker. That's the effect you want. You want both to be affected at the same time. Okay? Now I don't want it to be super dark. I just want it to be a little bit darker. So maybe -10, -20, just to create a difference in that appearance. All right? Did that make a little more sense? Yeah? You understood the steps of that? I applied an adjustment, but I put it outside of the folder. I clipped it to the folder so that it affects everything. I then just dropped the contrast totally, -50, and I lowered the brightness a little bit. And that's it. That is your cube. What are some things here that I could do? The crevice shadow is a little bit too straight and linear. Where is it right now? It's under my shadows here. I could take the crevice shadow and blur it a little bit. So with the crevice shadow, I can go to blur and apply a Gaussian blur. Maybe just do a 2-pixel blur or a 1-pixel blur to soften it up. That's about it. I could go back to my reflective highlights. And I can create a new layer, and I can really put in a solid reflective highlight here. At the corner. Remember that a reflective highlight, it's a highlight of the light source itself, so I could really come in and paint white here. Maybe I actually have the shape of a highlight in my object, like so. Play with that blending mode. Lower its opacity. Okay. But that is essentially it. If I look at my shadow, it's a little bit rough here. Like I see some of the straight lines, but I see also some cloudiness. I'm gonna wanna refine that a bit. So in my shadow, on the side here, so I'm gonna bring some of that back. Okay. I'm really going to want the shadow to start at the exact corner, so I'm going to come back here, just move it in, drop it a little bit. And that crevice shadow, the geometry of my cube, it's rounded there. I should also have my crevice shadow be rounded as well. So in my drop shadow here, small rounded brush, going to round out that shadow too, by painting in the mask. If I really wanted to, I could also alter the shape of the shadow, in cracks where it's raising. I could follow the line of my object along the bottom, eating into the shadow the same way that following the form of the mask and the marble.